Good morning. I'm Tom Wright, President and CEO of Regional Plan Association, the 100-year-old organization which you see featured in this fantastic exhibit around you. I hope that everybody here this morning has had a chance to check it out. I still enjoy walking through and reading and looking at the pictures again and again and again myself. It's great to see so many friends here this morning in Vanderbilt Hall, and I want to thank you all for being with us. I want to especially thank Melva and her fabulous team at ABNY for working with us on this important event, which marks a truly meaningful moment in the history of the New York metropolitan region. I also want to thank the fabulous staff at RPA. You see them at the front desk there. You've seen them setting this up. They are a truly amazing bunch, especially the folks who worked on and coordinated today's event: Rob Freudenberg, Ravina Purnanand, Julie Truax, Lacey Rosowski, everybody up there at the front. Thank you guys, you're amazing. So 10 years ago today, a Category 1 hurricane named Sandy made its first landfall on Jamaica. And over the next few days, it grew stronger and it wreaked havoc in the Caribbean before weakening and heading out to sea. An unusual weather phenomenon, however, blew the storm off its course, forcing it to make a sharp left turn directly into the New York, New Jersey, Connecticut metropolitan region as a superstorm that tragically altered the course of history in this city and beyond. Thanks to the foresight of leaders, planners, scientists, New York City was by no means wholly unprepared for the impacts of this dramatic storm. Actions taken leading up to and during the storm saved lives and infrastructure and communities. But we were, in many important ways, underprepared for the worst of what it brought us. During and following Sandy, we saw the best of our residents, community organizations, elected officials, and businesses and civic groups. And a new word for many of us, resilience, entered our everyday lexicon, where it remains today. And we relearned what we've known for too long, that the painful outcomes of a history and a legacy of racism, underinvestment, and marginalization for too many communities amplified the devastation of that storm. Recovery, by many measures, has been successful, but we know there is still very much to do. As an urban planner, I'm all too aware that planning is an imperfect profession. This exhibit around you shows both what we as an organization and a profession got right and where we fell short. Planning is also iterative. We must continuously be looking back in order to look forward and ensure that we do better. That's why we're here today to mark this moment. Our aim is not to purposelessly dwell on the past. Rather, we are here to look at how we handled this storm and its aftermath and ask ourselves, what did we get right? What could we have done better? And what must we be doing today to ensure that the accelerating impacts of climate change, coastal flooding from storms, urban flooding from extreme rainfall, long-term permanent flooding from sea level rise, and even the biggest killer of all, extreme heat waves, are all addressed head-on. We've been through a lot in this city over the past few decades. You could argue that lessons we learned from 9/11 helped pull us through some of the painful part of Sandy, and that lessons we learned from Sandy have helped us deal with COVID. New Yorkers are resilient by nature, but we must ensure that we are up to the challenge of facing the climate crisis, addressing its root causes, and equitably adapting our communities to the impacts that we are going to have to live with. I'm thrilled that we have such extraordinary leaders represented in the program today working on these issues, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing their wisdom and insights about what we've done. But first, it's my extreme pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Melva Miller, the CEO of ABNY. Melva, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Tom. Good afternoon, everyone. All right, so on behalf of ABNY's chairman, Stephen Rubenstein, and the rest of ABNY, I want to welcome you here today for this amazing event in this amazing space. Can I get a round of applause for this exhibition done by RPA? I just have to plug. It was a lot of work pulling this together. So if you get a moment after this, please take a look at all of the boards and the images above, because they really are amazing, especially as we think about the past, the present, and the future. So, 10 years ago, I was at Queensborough Hall working for then Borough President Helen Marshall, and Sandy hit. We had no idea what to do from a borough level, right? And as we think about sort of protecting our constituents, protecting the borough, protecting the coastal lines, we had to turn to experts to help us and guide us through that experience. And today's panel really are some of the experts that we had the opportunity to work with. For example, at the time, President Obama put together a committee for Sandy, and I had the opportunity to go down to DC, and who did I see chairing the Sandy task force was Sean Donovan, someone from my hometown. I was very, very honored to be in the room. I've never been out in Far Rockaway so much after Sandy. And I remember the first time after Sandy hit, going out to Far Rockaway on Beach Channel Drive in a container shed in a parking lot of a supermarket where I met Diane, who was facilitating all of the volunteer offers from around the world. People were coming to us asking us how could they help, and we didn't know what to say, but I had the opportunity to work with Diane, who helped us sort of consolidate and distribute sort of responsibility to all of the volunteers. And then thinking about sort of where do we go next, right? I had the opportunity to consult a very important document, Plan NYC, right, put together by RIT. We would not have known what to do if it were not for the experts on this panel. And then to run it all, right, we needed to make sure that there was someone in operations from City Hall. Had the opportunity to work with Cas on making sure that the city all worked together, bringing the private sector and the public sector to make sure that our city rebounded. So with that, I'd like to ask the panelists to please come up while I introduce them. So first, to my left, we have Rohit. I know no one calls him by that. They always refer to him as Rit. Aggarwala is the Chief Climate Officer and Commissioner, woo, at the New York City Department of Environmental Protection. Rit, known by his friends, an expert on urban sustainability, technology, and mobility, led the creation of the Mayor's Office of Long-Term Planning and Sustainability under Mayor Michael Bloomberg. He founded the Environmental Grant-Making Program at Bloomberg Philanthropies, and served as president of the board of directors of the C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group. He was part of the founding team at Sidewalk Labs, Google's urban technology startup, and more recently was a senior urban tech fellow at the Jacobs Cornell Technion Institute. He has provided advice and assistance to a number of founders and impact investment funds, and chaired the Regional Plan Association's 4th regional plan for the New York region. Right. Next, we have Sean Donovan, my friend. He is a senior fellow at the Ford Foundation. Sean has served in President Obama's cabinet for his full 8 years in office. From 2009 to 2014, he served as Secretary of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, where he led the fight against the nation's unprecedented foreclosure crisis, and directly related to today's discussion, served as chair of President Obama's Hurricane Sandy Rebuilding Task Force. In July of 2014, he was sworn in as Director of U.S. Office of Management and Budget. And prior to joining the Obama administration, many of us know him from this role, Sean served as the Commissioner of the New York City Department of Housing, Preservation, and Development. He also served in the Clinton administration as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Multifamily Housing at HUD and as acting FHA Commissioner during the Clinton-Bush president transition. Sean. And next, we have Diane Billings-Burford. She is the CEO of RISE, an organization that engages the sports community to advance values of respect, understanding, and tolerance and equity. During the past decade, Diane has held senior positions in New York City government and subsequently at Time Warner. At Time Warner, she served as executive director, cultural investments, and vice president of the Time Warner Foundation. She led the company-wide college internship, employee community engagement, and community investment program in New York City. She also managed the grant-making and operations of the foundation. As the city's chief service officer under Mayor Michael Bloomberg, she headed New York NYC Service, a division of the mayor's office, engaging more than 1.3 million New Yorkers in a range of volunteer activities. For the purpose of today's discussion, her role was essential as New York City Service worked to help New Yorkers connect to service opportunities during Sandy, steering volunteers to address the city's greatest needs, and promoting service as a core part of being a New Yorker in one of the most difficult times that our city had in recent history. Diane, everyone. And to facilitate today's discussion, we have Cas Holloway. He recently joined Shiftsmart as Vice President of Sales and Public Enterprise. Prior to Shiftsmart, Cas advised software companies on bringing their solutions to the public sector and spent 2 years at Uncork, a no-code software development platform. Before that, Cas was head of global technical operations at Bloomberg LP and served for 8 years in the administration of Michael Bloomberg, including as deputy mayor for operations and commissioner of the New York City Department of Environmental Protection. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you today's panel. Thank you.
Hello. All right, excellent. Well, Melva, thank you very much. Thank you to the RPA. Thank you to ABNY for this opportunity, and thank you for this wonderful exhibit. I actually took the opportunity to walk around a little bit beforehand, and I first came to New York City. I'm a third-generation suburb kid from Philadelphia. Not many people know that. I came in 1996 when the third plan came out. And to me, the RPA has always had a very special and important place, and it's probably never been more important than now. So thank you for hosting this today with ABNY, which has always been one of my favorite organizations. Okay, let's get to it. Good morning, everybody. And everybody's been introduced, so I am gonna just jump right in. And the structure today, we're gonna talk a little bit about the past, a little bit about the present, and then think a little bit about the future. But let's start by taking ourselves back just a little bit. And I'm gonna ask each of you to talk a little bit about the role that you were in when Sandy was approaching. Sean, you were in the Obama administration at the time. Just tell us a little bit about when you realized what the scale and scope of this was going to be and what your biggest concerns were.
So one of the sort of secrets about HUD, people think housing, urban development, they don't think disasters. And HUD, in fact, behind FEMA, is the most important agency in the federal government because Congress runs a huge amount of money through HUD, through the Community Development Block Grant Program, to help places recover. So a little bit to my surprise, I had spent my first few years as HUD secretary traveling around the country and seen tornadoes, floods, hurricanes, and it was brutal. I mean, if there's any moment where somebody, I don't care what party they're in, rural, urban, when you've seen your home, your entire community wiped out before your eyes, it is a profound experience of, I need help and I need my government to be here for me. And so fast forward to watching on TV from my living room in Washington, D.C., as the tunnels started to flood, as the blackouts rolled across huge parts of New York City, as places like the Rockaways and others were just wiped out. And it was brutal. And I will say it's very, very personal. I have good friends who lost their homes, their businesses. I live in Brooklyn, lots of friends in Red Hook and other communities that were hit. And a good friend lost his daughter in the storm, John Cast. And so it was excruciating for me to be sitting at home watching my hometown destroyed by this storm, knowing, having been to these communities around the country and seen what that means in people's lives, it was quite something. And so I immediately got on a train, a plane, however I could get to New York, and tried to come back as often as possible. And to your question about my role, one day I was in City Hall meeting with the Bloomberg administration about recovery and what we could do at HUD. And I got a call on my cell phone from the White House saying, will you hold for the president? And so I stepped out into the rotunda, and he said to me, Sean, we want to create this task force, and we want you to lead it. And of course I said yes. And then after I said yes, I asked, so tell me about what you want me to do. And one of the things he made very clear is this can't just be about certain pieces of the region recovering. It has to be in all of the region recovery. One of the things I'd seen over and over again is that those who are most vulnerable before a storm are always hurt the worst by the storms. And so he said, we're going to form this task force, and we really needed to get the region to work together. And so I said to him, so let me get this straight. You want me to get the mayor of New York, Mike Bloomberg, and soon to be Bill de Blasio, the governor of New Jersey, Chris Christie, and the governor of New York, Andrew Cuomo, to work together and collaborate on all of the recovery. And he said, yeah, Sean, you'll be okay. You speak New York. And but I ended up leading this task force, which I'm sure we'll come back and talk more about. And that was really my way of helping my hometown.
Wow, thank you, Sean. Well, actually, then turning to Diane. I wanted to just ask you, you were, Chief Service Officer at the time, and it'd be great to hear just your impressions of, from that perspective, how are you going to work to use that unique position to help with the recovery?
Yeah, well, I actually think I was in a great position. I didn't necessarily feel that way then. I wasn't in DC. I was right in New York. I'm a Brooklyn girl. And the truth is, I had actually had a surgery, wasn't 100%. We had literally just had million trees. I don't know if everyone remembers this, but right before Sandy hit, the weather was wonderful. And so we're planting trees. I almost get back home. I shouldn't even have been at work. And I get that call, the car and the driver's outside. If you could just help get people off the streets. And then we worked every day from then until forever. And so one of the things, because NYC Service is set up as a mayoral office that worked, we rolled out 30+ initiatives with agencies. And what that meant is by the time Sandy hit, we were in some ways, this nexus of relationships with multiple agencies, relationships with not-for-profits. I sat on and worked together on the same floor with the Mayor's Fund, so relationships to the resources. And so By the time we understood, oh, this is really like, this is going to be unbelievable. I would also add a bit of reference. Irene had just hit, and it was not what we expected. And we actually had rolled out and got folks to evacuate, and they felt like they evacuated for no reason. So by the time Sandy hit, we were unable to really get folks to leave. And so we had this added challenge of we had people in space. The space had been damaged. And how do we get everything we needed to them because they hadn't left the region that was damaged? And so we put up 16, I still remember this, 16 food, water, and supply distribution sites across the entire city. And then as we were able to assess, you know, I remember Patty Harris saying, Diane, how do we know when to take them down? And I was like, you know, we'll have different signals. And one day the Whole Foods opened up on the West Side Highway and people were going in and out the supermarket. I was like, I can shut that one down. But then you had places like the Rockaways and Red Hook and Coney Island. They were nowhere near that. They were nowhere near returning. And so then we really had to move to this phase of intermediate care. And then the last thing I would say about NYC service being uniquely situated is because we had relationship with parks and we needed places to put these distribution sites and relationships with NYCHA, and we needed places to put the distribution sites. And quite honestly, NYCHA has like the most contracts in the world, just so you know. If you need any buses, transportation, whatever, they always have an open contract. You just got to figure out how to get your stuff in it. And then, you know, there just were so many different agencies, and it allowed us to be what we always were, right? Which is to just take our usual role of being a nexus of saying, how do we take the power of the people and meet challenging needs? It was just a matter of how do we take the power of the people to meet the need that was right in front of us.
Thank you so much. And Rit, just turning to you for a second, one of the things that I was thinking as the storm was bearing down was I remembered that page in Plan YC where it was contemplated that this kind of something on this scale could happen, but almost like doing the hurricane recovery plan after Katrina, you're like, yes, we're doing the plan, yes, we're putting the things in place, but I mean, come on. What were you thinking?
Sorry.
It's on.
It is. All right. Well, first of all, thank you. Thanks to RPA and ABNY for having me, although at some point I'm going to have to register a complaint about, you know, seriously. But so many things wrong. So many things wrong. You know, so I was actually in California at the time. I was not here during Sandy. Some of you know I left the Bloomberg administration, moved over to C40 because my wife was doing her medical fellowship at Stanford at the time. So I was in Palo Alto that night. Yeah, I mean, the crazy thing was, it was the realization that everything we knew could and would happen was just happening a good 10, 20, 30 years sooner than we had expected. And so, yeah, there are a couple of these, but in Plan YC from 2007, we've got a photo of the entrance to the Battery Tunnel with a line across it, and below is shaded blue. And that is exactly what happened, right? Almost to precisely that level. But we genuinely, I think, thought we had more time. But we also did not have the public acceptance. And so if there was one horrible thing going through my mind, I mean, in addition to worrying about people I knew in New York and trying to figure out if there was any way that I could help from far away, was the sense that, wow, it's at least people will have to take this seriously now. And, you know, I remember particularly a headline when we came out, when the first report of the New York panel on climate change came out. And of course, very helpfully, the Post wrote an article about it, and the headline was, "Mayor prefers eggheads to jobs." Basically arguing that all of these crazy professors was saying stuff, and if the mayor actually took it seriously, it would kill the economy. And of course, that was all the stuff that we should have been doing and to a certain extent have been doing, but there's a lot more that we have to do.
Well, you've perfectly anticipated my next question. So thank you for the background. It's great to kind of pull us back into that time a little bit, but let's now come to the present. The 10th anniversary has been a time for reflection. I've noticed on one of the boards, Mayor Bloomberg did order an accelerated plan for the special initiative on recovery and resilience. I always sometimes confuse what the R and the R are, but which was a blueprint in its way. But now there have been a number of pieces. The Times did a piece over the weekend. National Geographic did what I thought was, a really interesting piece, and the Comptroller did a report on kind of where we are right now that I thought was very even-handed. Sean, coming back to the task force, what is the legacy 10 years on? Was it successful?
So the first thing to say is that they call them disasters for a reason. And I have not seen a single recovery, a single kind of all of government response that didn't leave thousands, hundreds of thousands of people slowly rebuilding, recovering their lives. And we should just recognize that when we talk about successes and failures, it's real. And in a situation like Sandy, there is no perfect answer. There is no perfect response. There was heroism on every block and in every community, but there were also tragedy on every block at every community. And so I want to frame it in that respect. Having been welcomed into government, my first trip related to my responsibilities around disasters was to New Orleans a month after I started. It was 4.5 years after Katrina had hit, and there were neighborhoods that looked like the storm had been yesterday. And so in that sense, I think to use the word resilience, the resilience, the heroism of New Yorkers to me really stands out. I think we recovered more quickly, more completely than just about anywhere that I had experienced. I hope that the Sandy Task Force and the coordination we played, the ways we tried to speed up federal money getting to communities helped. But I think there was clearly a pace and a ability to recover that was unique in my experience of what I've seen around the country and even around the world. Having said that, I think the legacy for me of the task force, we were not the first responders. We were focused on the longer term recovery. To the extent that there is a real legacy of that, I think it is that we, working with the city, working with the states, put in place a set of things that will help us be safer next time in terms of our building codes, our zoning codes, our flood maps, a range of those things. Those things are extremely hard politically, and we can come back and talk about the challenges of what it means when you have to say to a community, like in Staten Island, we're not going to provide money because it's too dangerous to live here, or we're going to try to elevate your homes or change your communities in fundamental ways. Those are hard, but I think we did make progress on those. And I think the other legacy I would point to, many of them around the room here, is to try to bring together all of the agencies in the city, all of the federal agencies, state agencies, and say, we can't just build back the way we were. We have to think about, as President Obama always said, a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. What is the wake-up call we have to take from this in terms of the way we build differently? And whether that was rebuild by design, you see the East Side Coastal Resiliency here as part of the Big U, Living Breakwaters, many, I think, transformative projects that have come out of that effort that I think, set a guidepost for us on where we need to go. We have not gone there, though. Let's be clear. We're not far enough. We're not comprehensive enough in being prepared for the next storm. And I do want to come back and talk about what more we can and should do going forward.
Thank you. Diane, anything to offer there?
I would say, right, in our present, it's interesting. I mean, it's the past now as well, but I referenced 2020 as this perfect storm. And I think in some ways, right, what we were dealing with 10 years ago was primarily how not only do we address folks' needs, but how do we address the inequity that is changing, that's giving them a very disparate experience of what their needs were. And so I think, one thing about the present is I do think more people are at least trying to be more aware of inequities and correcting them. I always think about the Build Back plan that you came up with, and being out in the Rockaways, some folks hated it. But the truth is, it was us dealing with inequities. There were people that had insurance, their houses were in perfectly fine places, they could get everything they needed. By the time you blinked, the house was gutted, new things were built. And then there were people in places, we weren't exactly sure what to do with Breezy. What do you do with a whole place full of, quite honestly, families connected to firemen, and we couldn't put out a fire in the middle of a storm and watch the thing burn to the ground in some instances? Do you say we can't rebuild here? And then we also had folks who were just sincerely working poor, and they had homes, but again, back to your program, this was for the folks that I have a home, but I have no resources to actually, forget resiliency. I don't even have the resources to gut it, and to address mold. And so I think presently we probably are more aware of inequities and more ready to deal with these inequities, and understand that we're going to have very different experiences just based on our different elements of our life. So I do feel happy about that. And yet, we could look at, there was a distinction between Arvin by the Sea, which is a community that had been built, and it, in some ways, Sandy was the test. Arvin by the Sea was back up.
I remember cutting the ribbon with
Right.
Mayor Bloomberg. Yep.
And it passed the test. Arvin by the Sea, again, it sustained damage, but it was back up. The Stop and Shop was open. Melva mentioned it, but I got to have my trailer in my office in the Wallbounds parking lot because it was not built to those specifications. And it literally took us months to get that business back up and running. And so even as I think presently we're more able to address inequities and just say what it is and get at it, to Sean's point, we haven't done some of the things we know we need to do. We know what works, so everything should look like what works, but it doesn't, right? We didn't build it back quite that way, and so, we still got some more work to do.
Well, Rit, that actually turns us to you as the person on this panel who now.
Did I notice that all three of you left government? Is that the same time I was coming back? You all figures anyway.
Well, Commissioner, you have a unique role now. Before we get into the future, just tell us a little bit about where you think we are 10 years after Sandy, and kind of from your vantage point.
Well, look, I'll share the way I think about the city and where we are in terms of 10 years since Sandy is similar to what I perceived last fall. I went wearing a different hat to the COP in Glasgow. And, you had Mark Carney putting out like $1 trillion in private money and, all of this seeming government action. And every conversation I had at that event followed exactly the same trajectory, which is, wow, isn't it amazing all the stuff that's going on? And oh my God, there is no way it is big enough or fast enough. And unfortunately, I think it's the same story here, right? New York is significantly better off now in terms of the risk of coastal inundation than it was a decade ago. And it is nowhere near where it needs to be and needs to get to in terms of climate resilience. I think what we have seen, and you know, Cas, you cited the controller's report, which I think is actually a really good piece of work, and I give the controller's office a lot of credit. It's hard hitting, but I think it's quite even-handed. Demonstrates that, unsurprisingly, the stuff that was most responsive, most flexible, and smallest scale got done very quickly, right? Formula grants that give the city significant flexibility, that all got spent really quickly. When it came to people rebuilding their own homes, to the extent that they had insurance, to the extent that they got money from FEMA, that happened very quickly. At the next level, larger buildings, we've had a lot of progress, both in the private sector and in the public sector, particularly, and I think relatively few people appreciate all the progress that NYCHA has made in learning lessons that aren't necessarily going to prevent flooding, but will, in the true sense of what resilience means, allow flooding to happen without the long-term catastrophic impact, right? And my own agency at DEP, that's been a lot of our efforts, kind of, as you well know, Cas, you know, by definition, all of our treatment plants are right on the water. And they are at sea level because the water's got to flow into the harbor, right? And what our strategy has been is not to think that we can elevate them so that they are protected from flooding, but we can harden them so that when the flooding happens, they can be shut down for a couple of hours, dried out, and get back online within 12 or 24 hours, as opposed to having millions of dollars and months of work that has to happen to do the repairs. And I think we've seen a lot of that, again, particularly at NYCHA, in a lot of private sector buildings as well. The slowest stuff, of course, is the community-wide work, right? The stuff that looks like East Side coastal resilience, that looks like what we have to build on the South Shore of Staten Island. Some of that is because the way those federal programs were designed, they required applications and competitive grants and all sorts of stuff. Some of it is because big projects just take years and years to design, and some of it is because all of us as a community, as a society, really as a nation and as a species, we're coming to terms with the fact that climate change is going to cost us. Like, it's going to cost us money. It's also going to cost us things we care about. And, you know, do I wish we could build Esker in a way that looks a little more like that, looks a little more like what you and what Amy's team had put together? Of course. But we're going to have to cut down trees. And people are going to lose their views. And there is going to be bad stuff that happens as we figure out how to cope with the climate change that sadly we've been unable as a society to get ahead of.
Well, thank you. On that point, let me ask the panel, I mean, what should we be talking about here? Sandy is one thing, but then, of course, 2 years ago, or even a year and a half, it was Hurricane Ida, right? And 13 people lost their lives. And I look at that and I think, I was shocked. You know, at least with a storm, you know it's coming 96 hours in advance. You don't know how bad it's going to be, but it is what it is. So are we thinking about this climate resilience challenge the right way, or is there kind of a Maginot line a little bit in terms of we're preparing for this inundation, but our fundamental systems aren't where they need to be?
So a few thoughts on that, Cas. One is, so often in life we fight the last war, right? And so while Sandy is a kind of threat that we have to be prepared for, there's also, you know, incredible increases in heat, downpours that are gonna, you know, flood from inside our neighborhoods rather than from the ocean, and a whole range of other things that we have to be prepared for. So we can't get distracted by fighting the last war. We have to think comprehensively about all those threats. Second, I would say that one of the things, you know, when I was appointed to lead the task force, it happened to be that we were going to Berlin, Germany that New Year to visit some friends who were living there for the year. And as my teenage sons were very excited to find out, I decided to go tour flood protection measures in the Netherlands on our family holiday. But it was a profound experience for me. And one of the things I remember most is that they had this unbelievably massive floodgate in the harbor of Rotterdam, one of the most important harbors in the world. And right next door to this floodgate is a child education center, because just about every child in the Netherlands goes to see this flood protection measure, right? Now, more than half of the people, more than half of the GDP of the Netherlands is below sea level, so water is an existential threat to their lives. But what struck me is that there is a culture of resilience where everyone understands in their personal lives, in their communities, in their government, there's something they need to do. And we have to get to the point in New York, and I think there's no better person that understands this than Rit, and frankly is set up both with his role in City Hall and as an agency head of DEP, is positioned to do this, no pressure. But literally every time we plant a tree, every time we repave a sidewalk, every time we do anything in this city, every agency has to be the resilience agency. And you've got to create a culture where those agencies can work together, because if we are just building a road and not making flood protection, if we're just installing new broadband cable or whatever infrastructure project it is, if it isn't also a resilience project, we have failed. That was one of the lessons, I think, of Rebuild by Design, is to really think about multifunctional infrastructure. And I have to say, I think that, for me, is one of the most profound things that I worry about for the city. And whether it's East Side Coastal Resiliency, yes, all the things Rit said are true, but it took probably 4 years longer than it should have, and it used up enormous community capital that had been built in building consensus around those projects that we shouldn't have had to use. And so for me, it is how do we, in our personal lives, but also in government, how do we structure this culture of resilience to make sure that we make the best use of every dollar? And the last thing I would say is, speaking of dollars, we have a moment we are never going to see in our lifetimes again. I call them the three uncles: Uncle Ira, the Inflation Reduction Act; Uncle Bill, the bipartisan infrastructure law; and Uncle Chip, which is, if you missed the announcement, we now have a massive manufacturing plant for computer chips that's coming to upstate New York. We have an opportunity we will not have again. And so this is always important to get aligned around this, but if we don't do it right now, shame on us.
I guess that means it's my turn. The thing I keep coming back to, I do see incredible improvements in infrastructure. I think my larger concern is, for the future, do we have the relationships that are necessary? Because we're not actually, to your point, Sean, we're not going to stop disasters from happening, right? And to your point, Rick, we're not going to stop the damage that the disasters cause. But we know when that happens, actual people need to be taken care of, and the government has a role in that. And I think one thing that's really important for the future, we figured it out at various levels, but I think we need to leave less to figuring it out when it comes to the relationship, the intergovernmental relationships, the interagency relationships, on how do we meet the needs of the people. I think we've got some complications now we didn't have before. We didn't have a federal monitor at NYCHA. We've got some things going now that we didn't have before, and so we really do need to think about the agencies that are super important to meeting folks' needs who are most in need, and intergovernmental relationships that are in place. And then lastly, I would say, I was just reading the report we did a year after Sandy. We had 21,000 donors give over, $60 million. I left government in part because I just saw how much we needed to have that relationship between government and private sector. And I don't know that that plan either is solidified enough for us to be as responsive as we need to be.
It's all right. So I'll say, I think one of the things that I think we are increasingly getting right is across several levels of government, we've gotten over what you were describing, Sean, as fighting the last war. I think there was very much a sense in the first several years after Sandy that the only thing New York had to worry about was another Sandy. And certainly I can say the Adams administration does not think that way, that we are certainly focused on a multi-hazard approach to climate resilience. Tom, I was pleased that you mentioned the fact that while we lost 43 people in Sandy and another 13 in Ida, 370 New Yorkers have died from excessive heat attributable to climate change over the last decade. And so it is heat that kills far more than water. Ida showed us, and in fact, interestingly, from my perspective, Ida, one of the most heartening things is that Ida did not come alone. Ida came on the heels of Henri. And then since Ida, we've had a number of these highly targeted microbursts, including the one that caused that spectacular white van going into a sewer in July in Morris Park. And what's been really interesting is I think that has given people the understanding that this is, in fact, the new normal, that it wasn't a one-off, we can't forget it. And so I think there is an increasing understanding in the public and among electeds that things are going to have to change, that we have to do things differently. We came very close to having a real drought this summer. And in fact, at DEP, we were beginning to start paying attention to that and gearing up, right? And the drought that's affected Europe, the drought that's affecting the West, at some point it's going to come to us too, right? And it has massive impacts. So I do think we are turning the corner on thinking really broadly. I think the biggest challenge we have is that there is so much to do, and I think even more than a decade ago, government is working much more slowly than it can, and than frankly I think it used to. And it's one of the reasons that we have, for example, this capital process reform task force that is working very hard, happily in conjunction with the controller and with the private sector to identify how capital projects can be sped up. I tell lots of people that when it comes to my priorities as Chief Climate Officer, there are two. One is getting Local Law 97 implemented right, because that's how we stop the bleeding. That's how we reduce carbon emissions in a meaningful way. The other one is reforming DEP's procurement process, because we have a $2.5 billion a year average capital plan. We cannot spend all that money with the processes we have. We underspent our capital budget next year. $2.5 billion a year is not going to get us anywhere near the resilience we need, right? And until we can get the capital projects underway faster, we can put up whatever pretty pictures we want. It's all fiction. We can get whatever federal grants we want. We can't use it, right? And so fundamentally, we've got to increase the metabolism of city government on really big things.
I like that metaphor. Now, I want to give people the opportunity to ask some questions, but I do have one final question for the panel, and it does concern the issue of planning. One of the things about the RPA that is so impressive is that so many of the things that have been in their plans have actually come to pass, even if they seemed utterly, fantastical at the time. But the question I have is, do we have the plan that we need? You raise the issue of governance, and do all of these levels of government actually work together? New York City could do everything right, but it is just one actor in a with all of these different actors. The fourth plan, in very important ways, is a climate plan. Is it the right plan? Is it enough? Is it thinking, are we thinking big enough and far ahead enough? And do we have that blueprint to act on? Or is there still something needed there?
I'll say I don't think we have the plan. I also don't know that we are ever going to have the plan. All right. Number one, the reality is climate change is still evolving as much as we know it it is happening. Like, of course, that's not under debate. But exactly what will happen and when that will happen is still evolving. So the idea that in 2022 we could come up with the plan and stick to it forever is just like suggesting we should still do everything based on the first regional plan of 1929, right? So I think that's number one. We're going to have to update it all the time. I think there was, perhaps self-servingly, I think there was a lot of wisdom in the fourth plan. I think there's a lot of stuff that I look, Meadowlands National Park. I mean, there are some creative ideas in there that we really have to embrace. But I think the two things that certainly I know are going on. One is, as you know, New York City by law has to update the sustainability plan. It's got to come out next April. That will be a portion of the plan that we need. And then, as many of you know, the Army Corps of Engineers is undertaking this harbor and tributaries study, which is, from the Army Corps' point of view, basically the coastal protection strategy for the whole region. And that's going to be an important contribution to the plan.
Yeah, I would add a couple things to that. I totally agree. I think, to go back to Rit's point about how do we move government, how do we move communities in the right direction, there is nothing like the clarity of a plan. Plan YC did that for all of us, I think, in the Bloomberg administration in powerful ways. And we have to be doing that kind of planning, and we have to be doing a pitch for the RPA here. We have to be doing it on a regional level, because as we saw in Sandy, a superstorm doesn't know the difference between New Jersey and New York or Connecticut. And as we recover, every little community in the region trying to do this themselves and reinvent the wheel is a disaster of a man-made kind. So, but I will also say there is a way in which we have to complement master planning with community planning in a very fundamental way. And I think it's amazing how much we have advanced the possibilities of engaging communities, whether it's with the kind of techniques we used in Rebuild by Design, food trucks with sponges on the side, out in communities, engaging people at picnics and all like really understanding what it means to take community visioning about where a community should be, especially in the lowest income communities, which are going to suffer the most and are going to need the most investment to be ready, to all the work that can be done in using technology and other things to help people really see what their communities could become. That kind of planning, to Rit's point, has to be happening every single day. And I really believe that the way you bring this culture of resilience, just like those kids going in to see the dam starting in kindergarten, is engaging people with the ideas of here's what's coming, here's what the risks are, what should we do about it? Not what should he do about it in his role, but what should we do about it, is a really, really powerful part of the planning that we need to be doing.
Good job.
All right. Thank you so much. So I want to turn it over to the room now. And you have an opportunity to ask this esteemed panel better questions than I did.
Hello? Good afternoon, everybody. Will Fisher here. I actually spent 4 years working on Build It Back, and it's an interesting time here to reflect on all of that. I think I would love to follow up with the other two panelists on the point that, Sean, that you just made regarding the fact that we need so much community buy-in, so much political will. I think of ESCR, but also smaller scale projects. Particularly with Sandy this far in the past, 10 years away, how do we keep this on the top of people's mind? How do we keep it, ahead of inflation and jobs issues and everything else that's happening in the world right now? Because it continues to be urgent, but let's not forget about it until it happens again, right?
I can take it if you'd like.
was like, why did I get that question? No.
Oh, well, I'm just trying to be
I know why I
polite.
got
But I guess, Will, I would say, I don't think we have to fight very hard. I mean, I certainly in my role, I do not meet with an elected official whose top priority is not to talk about flooding. Most of it is stormwater flooding, but honestly, that distinction is meaningless to most people, and in a lot of ways, it's meaningless to us, right? I mean, there's a lot of overlap between what you have to do. I mean, the sad reality is, you know, what was, I forget now the line about, if something's inevitable, it's pretty much bound to happen. Like, climate change is going to keep hitting us over the head until we take it seriously. And so we kind of have that going for us. I think, in fact, people are increasingly sophisticated about the need to do stuff. I think people are increasingly pragmatic about the trade-offs that are necessary. I think the difficulty is going to come, Sean, you touched on it, when it comes to having hard conversations with people who live in a place that it's really impossible to protect, right? And what we do about those places, I think, that's a conversation that only a handful of folks have really been ready to take front and center.
I would add, because I do feel what you're saying, and I understand the question. One of the benefits I think of Sandy is that its impact hit all of those areas, and so it did provide us. We didn't have to pitch, right? Like, it literally wasn't about this storm or my business, because this storm took out my business, right? It wasn't this storm or like my house, because this storm took out your house. So it really did give us that advantage. One of the challenges I do think that we've got to face, and I think Sean's last comments touched on it, is we also do need to understand, though, when we're talking to different parts of the community and we're asking them to make a false choice because they really don't have the resources to do the necessities. And even though it would be prudent, it actually might not be a necessity at the moment. And so, again, I really commend us. I think we stepped in when we realized we were expecting folks to make those false choices 10 years ago. But we've got to keep remembering that when we're talking to different communities, to them, it will feel like, because it is a false choice.
Hi, my name's Claire Mifflin. I was an architect. I am an architect, but now I used to focus on energy, and now it has hit me that waste and consumption is a huge issue that's kind of a blind spot. So I head up the Center for Zero Waste Design, and I'm grateful for ABNY for having a grant to look at waste. But my question is, I think it relates to the last one. Composting, collecting food scraps, making soil from waste has a huge role in terms of helping physical and social community resilience. And how do you think that could tie into the plan moving forward, and realizing that it is a kind of system-wide solution in terms of we want to get rid of rats on streets, we have to design buildings, streetscapes, so we can separate waste well, but also reuse and start circularity in terms of getting compost into soils, helping stormwater infiltration. Just a question, where do you think there's a role to play there? Thank you.
Sure, well, I'll just, I will.
Before he starts, I just want to say this is a personal issue of mine that is one of my favorites. Thank you for asking. Rhett.
Well, first of all, I'll say, as many of you I think know, the Adams administration has been very clearly focused on getting organics collection back and getting it right. I'm very pleased to point out that we now have underway the largest organics collection system in the United States, where we have full curbside organics collection going on across all of Queens, including at multifamily buildings, which is a critical change from what had been there before. I think to his credit, the mayor understood, and Sanitation Commissioner Tisch understood, to go from 0 to 5 boroughs all at once was a bad idea, and so the idea is actually to make a real difference in Queens, but also learn a bunch of lessons, fine-tune it, and then take it citywide, which is certainly the intention. Some of that organics is actually going to DEP facilities to be digested. Some of it is getting composted, and those are both things that we will look to be growing over time. And your point about how we think about the soil, I think there's a lot that we can think through once we have that first step of how do we collect it figured out. And you mentioned containerization, which I guess has some overlay. I'll have to make a good case for that. You'll have to send me notes on how to tie that into resilience. But obviously that has been a major focus of this administration, and I'm sure will continue to be.
If I could just add, on a personal note, I'm a lapsed architect as well before I decided to become a bureaucrat, and married to a landscape architect, so spend a lot of my time thinking about and with my hands in dirt as well. So I appreciate this question as well. I think two broader points. One is, we talked about planning earlier, but I think there is an enormous power for designers to a role to play in this. The regional plans, Plan YC, they're not just acts of planning, they're acts of design. And I always like to say that the power of design is to imagine things we've never seen before, right? That is what design is, and that's what we need in a moment where, none of us, the definition of a once-in-a-lifetime storm is that there's no one around who's actually lived through it, right? And therefore, we need invention. We need to be looking at other models. And I think there's an incredibly important role for everyone in this audience and for designers more broadly to play in this. The other thing I would say, sort of taking off on your point a little bit and tying it back to the question of trade-offs families have to make about this, is I think one of the exciting things about the moment that we're in, and I think it was coming before all the legislation passed this summer, but particularly with IRA, with the climate bill cleverly disguised as the Inflation Reduction Act, we're now at a moment where we can see in the next decade that adapting to climate change isn't just about what you have to give up, but there's a potential for massive amounts of savings, particularly for the lowest income families, right? And the combination of all the offshore wind that's happening, renewable energy, we need to start to really figure out what are the vehicles by which we can bring especially the most vulnerable communities, whether it's on their energy sources, whether it's on using the fact that insurance in the private sector is going to suffer dramatically if they don't better protect our homes and our communities. All of that, I think, is an opportunity because this change is so real and has accelerated so much, for us to start to frame this in a way of what are we gaining, right? And what can we do both in terms of costs and opportunity for New Yorkers that this moment can bring us? And to me, it's one of the things that is very different today than it was when Sandy happened. We did all the polling. We knew about it at the White House. We even invited weather people from all over the country to come and hear about the national climate assessment that we'd just done, because we knew that most of the American people, much less in New York, didn't understand the nature of the threat. I agree with Rit. I think people do now. The question is, how do we translate that into hopefulness and optimism about this moment? Because most people I know this is coming. They also don't really know what they can do.
One more? Oh, I can have the last. Oh, great. Okay. One more question from the audience. Sure.
I feel guilty taking the last question, but I'll do it anyway. I wanted to get onto the kind of institutional issues that Rit was talking about, and I'll say here at RPA, and since we are RPA focused a little outside New York City, I hope folks. Well, I'm sorry to have my back to you. But we point out at RPA, where we have 3 different states, 31 counties, 782 towns and cities, of which 1 is New York City and 781 are not. And we didn't have an image about it, but another of the key recommendations in the 4th regional plan was trying to coordinate kind of regional commissions to try to create plans, because if each municipality, if 781 towns and cities in the region are all figuring out how to protect themselves from floods, they will very effectively flood their neighbors. And so we've been thinking a lot about how to try and get those things off the ground. And Sean, I appreciate your comment about the 3 uncles, but I'll say prior to Superstorm Sandy, probably we would have wanted to have you here to talk at an RPA event because of your prior legacy, which was the Sustainable Communities Initiative, and what you'd done at the federal government, trying to have the federal government be a kind of partner with towns and cities to coordinate their planning efforts. And I think for some of us it's been disheartening because we just haven't seen much traction with that. I point out to people that all the great stuff in New Rochelle and Bridgeport was kind of funded by grants that you made available originally. But I'm not seeing the kind of movement at the federal level on those kinds of issues. Now maybe I'm missing it, or if you were still back there, what would you be doing to try and get those conversations going again? Because I think they're very important to that larger issue of institutions matter, and we still just don't seem to have many institutions thinking on a regional basis. Sorry to put it to you that way.
An easy question to end. Thanks, Tom. We can take this to a drink somewhere and keep talking about it. Look, I think a few things. One is, I felt this way starting in the middle of the worst housing crisis of our lifetimes, that there has been such a focus on crisis solving in the administration that I think it has been hard to do some of this longer term thinking. Having said that, I think there is a big opportunity in the 3 uncles to, whether it's the regional planning grants, whether it's things like MEGA and other programs that allow you to really take on large sort of regional scale infrastructure projects. There are opportunities to do it. And I think that there are ways in which we have to capitalize on the institutions that we do have, RPA being one of them, but also the port, MTA. We have a set of structures that are regional that I think we need to engage more broadly in what are they doing around planning and thinking through these things in a way that could be powerful. So I think those are the opportunities. One of our problems, I've always felt like, is, New York almost owns its own suburbs in some ways, in the sense that compared to most cities, we have an incredible range. We have, obviously coming up on 9 million people. And so I think it has always been a challenge, as I see it, and it's harder in some ways to do regional planning in New York than I saw in communities like Denver or San Francisco or others, where the central city really is, or Boston, is a small piece of the overall metro area. So my perspective in city government is it's sort of easy to think, oh yeah, those small fries outside the city, they're not, and it's harder to do. But what I would suggest, the best collaboration efforts I've always seen have started with something very concrete, right? How do we solve the housing challenge? How do we solve the transportation? And pick 2 or 3 things that at this moment there are opportunities around funding, and try to align people around those, and then build from there, is the way I would think about this moment.
Thank you. Do I still have time for a final question? All right, so thank you for that. So I have a final question, and it goes back to something, Sean, you said at the beginning, which I took as something like the following. What can we do to make sure that every project is in some way a resilience project? What does that mean? What would that mean for the city at the capital project level? And I note that Sherry Hyman is here, who has some of the responsibility for the mayor's task force on this. So Sherry, we're excited to see what you're going to come out with. What does that mean to you, and how could that actually be implemented? Who wants to start?
I'll start. Thank goodness I'm not an architect or things would be falling down around us. But I am, as a recovering attorney and an educator, I think, as I listen to all these questions, especially the one about organic waste, I think we've got to circle back to education. I think that I think one of the ways that every project can become a resilience project is we've got to educate communities, individuals, but we also have to educate folks sitting in agencies about the connectivity, right? And I think there is that missing piece. I think there are those of us that totally understand it, and there are those of us going about our everyday, doing our level best, and really are lacking an understanding about how we would make every project a resiliency project, and even why they're connected.
I'll say, I think, well, much like the fundamental realization behind Local Law 97 was that there's no amount of incentive or encouragement that you can get property owners to reduce their carbon emissions. You just have to tell them to do it. I think the reality is we have to do that with government and with design requirements. We already have some of that going on, and this was something I will credit the de Blasio administration with having started. Climate design guidelines that are now taken into account in all city projects. And we've just got to do a lot more of that and remind agencies that they have to be held accountable for other things. 15 years ago, I know full well, you were there at the time, like as was you, Cas, were you, Cas? When we started Plan YC, we had lots of agencies that said, yeah, that's not what we need to worry about, right? Reducing carbon emissions is irrelevant to the parks. Well, Adrian never said that, but nonetheless, but still, a lot of agencies had that perspective. And I think we've now gotten most agencies to realize that, yeah, I need to think about it, but I don't know that I can take on new costs, and I don't know that maintaining that new functionality is really my job, right? And we're just gonna have to realize that our jobs have changed as agencies. And that's gotta flow through standards, and it's already begun to flow through the building code. There's gonna have to be more to come on that score.
Yeah, I would agree with both the comments, because I think there's a top-down and there's a bottom-up side, and they're both true. One of the things that we did in the Sandy Task Force, most people don't know, especially in the New York region, very focused on what we're doing in New York, but we brought together, and continued it when I went to OMB, every single agency, we're gonna use updated flood projections, right? And you're gonna have to look out, depending on how long whatever you're building is gonna be in place, you're gonna have to incorporate X number of feet of sea level rise, for example, right? And one of the things that was striking to me, yes, you gotta tell them, and that there's no substitute for that. But lots of them said, we want to do this, we don't know how, or we don't know what the science is, right? So part of this is putting the tools in the hands of folks around government. I will say, there are lots of things that I've had to push through that were, not always welcomed among my agencies. Climate change is not one of them. People get it, and people want to make a difference on this, and so it's a combination of carrots and sticks. And then the last thing, just to go back to the education point, which I couldn't agree with more, we have to be able to put in the hands of New Yorkers the concrete things that they can do, right? If you have gather roof water and use it as gray water, what can you do on composting, and a whole range of things, and educate around those things, I think is hugely important as well to how we get to that culture of resilience.
Can I build on that, Sean, actually? And as Diane made her comment, I was thinking about that similarly, which is here, particularly in New York, we've got to get New Yorkers to embrace the fact that they have responsibility for protecting themselves as well, right? Because some of it is the overall, well, what can I do to help reduce greenhouse gas emissions and all of that? but some of it is we just don't have the culture here that says, well, the weather can kill me, right? We assume that the city will protect me somehow, right? And it is no longer the case, because for 400 years, this city has existed in a really, really mild climate. That aside from the occasional blizzard or a hurricane that would come along, I mean, really you can count on one or two hands in 400 years of history the truly damaging hurricanes, right? But now we have these microbursts, these cloud bursts that are coming. Now we have heat waves that can really kill you, and they're going to start happening every summer, right? And so New Yorkers have got to realize that they've got to have the flood insurance, right? They've got to be paying attention when the weather comes, and know you stay home when the rain is really bad. And by the way, you don't order a damn burrito and make some deliverista go out when it's raining 4 inches an hour either, right? And like, we haven't trained people to do that in the way that if you live in California, you know you have a responsibility to make your home earthquake proof. Even if you don't have much money, you still have got to do that for your kids. And if you live in the Midwest, you have got to know what to do when there's a tornado warning, right? Because the government is not going to protect you. And if you're in Florida, as they were reminded recently, they aren't going to get any help. The city of Miami has the slogan, which I love, the first 72, it's up to you. Have enough water, have enough food, and have enough medicine in your home at all times that you can make it through 3 days, because 3 days after an emergency, the government is not going to be able to help you. And we've got to have New Yorkers start accepting that that's part of life here as well.
Well, thank you.
I'll just say, I just want to say thank you, Cas, for wonderful moderating job, an extraordinary panel. I was thinking about the education comment, Diane, too, and thinking, well, that's what we do as civic organizations. That's why we convene these kinds of forums. I learned a lot this morning, and that's why we host these kinds of exhibits, because we want to educate people about the city and the region that they live in, why it looks and functions the way it does. And so that's part of all of our core mission. You have all been an extraordinary panel. Thank you to everybody for joining us this morning. And I want to specifically, again, thanks the folks who put together this incredible exhibit. It is coming down on Wednesday, I am sad to say. So come see it now, invite your friends to see it. It might have a second life somewhere else. But James Sanders, Steve Grober, the people who put this together, we want to get as many people into it as we possibly can. So thank you again for joining us. Thank you for this conversation. Thank you, ABNY. Have a great day.